Welcome back to Watercolours with Caroline for another session this spring, and our focus this time is going to be waterworks, all kinds of compositions to do with water. It might be beach birds or rocks or shells or watermills or you name it. If it's water, it'll be in there somewhere. So today we're going to start off with a reference photo sent to me by Debra Butterworth from her holiday in Thailand. It's Maenam Beach, a beautiful sunny beach with palm trees, iconic sunny beach. And we're going to paint this on 5-inch by 7-inch paper. I'm using Arches 140-pound cold press paper. You use what you like and your paints and just enjoy. So if you look at the photo, the sky up here at the top near the corner is a little bit darker than the sky down here, which is more of a cerulean color. So we're going to use the cerulean down here where there's less cloud. And then up here, we're going to mix cobalt and a little bit of phthalo blue. I think I used cobalt and phthalo blue. Let me just double check and make sure. Yep, cobalt and phthalo blue. And if you don't have cobalt, then you can use ultramarine and phthalo blue up here, or you can use cerulean and a little phthalo blue. It's up to you. You don't have to do the exact colors. And we're going to leave all the white clouds just white paper. And I'm not going to worry about all of this kind of gray blue here. That's too much for us to worry about in a small painting. I'm just going to leave white clouds. So we're going to get the cerulean blue ready, or manganese blue, and then I'm going to do the cobalt. Cobalt is a bit warmer blue than the cerulean. Cerulean and cobalt are great colors because you can wash them off, you can dab them back if you want to make more white clouds. Phthalo blue stains, so I'm going to be very careful and use just a little bit of phthalo blue in with that cobalt just to make it a little bit brighter, not too much. Now, I had this bit of cheap paper yesterday to show people what these colors look like full strength, and we don't want to use them full strength because phthalo blue full strength is very, very strong and it stains. We can't get it off the paper. But if we use phthalo blue very diluted, we get a lovely cool, you could even use this instead of the cerulean if you didn't have any, as long as you use lots of water. Look at the difference between phthalo blue with lots of water and phthalo blue with very little water. So you get an extremely different blue. And also if you use lots of water with the phthalo blue, it's going to be easier to dab a little bit off if you need to make a little bit more cloud. Whereas the staining blue, much more difficult. So get your colors ready and then use a fairly big brush, an 8 or a 10, and wet your paper. Make sure you keep dipping your brush in the water and wetting your paper. You can't just make it damp. Okay, now lift your paper up and check it to see if there's any spots that are not wet. And I see a little spot in the corner here and a corner here that are not wet. What people found yesterday was the center of their paper was quite wet, but the edges dried very quickly. So you need to make sure that those edges are wet too. And let it soak in. This is cotton paper. The paper I was showing you over here is very cheap pulp student paper, not as nice, so I just use that to test my colors. The cotton paper will stay wet much longer and give you much better effects. Now we're going to use the whole paper for the warm-up, but not for the real painting. So I'm going to start with my cerulean. This is my cerulean here. I'm going to put a little bit more on my brush. And I'm going to start at the bottom of this piece of paper, and I'm going to do horizontal strokes with the cerulean. And this is representing the sky near the horizon. I don't need to leave as much white showing. Sometimes there might be some streaky white clouds. Now, as you come up to the top of the sky where you want a nice contrast between the clouds and the sky, that's when I'm going to switch to the cobalt with the touch of phthalo in it, or just cobalt. If you just have cobalt, that's okay, but it just needs to be a little bit darker. And I'm going to test it on that corner to see how dark it is. Maybe add a touch more water because it may be a little bit too dark. You don't want it too watery. If it's too watery, it's just going to dissolve into the water. And now as I put this blue down up here, I need to form clouds. So I'm painting the sky behind the clouds. And go carefully, you don't have to rush. If your paper's nice and wet, it's not vital that you rush. You can look at your, if you want to look at your reference photo, you can have it close to you. And I just grabbed mine to have a little look at what was going on with the clouds there. And we're going to have trees over on the left, but don't leave blank space behind your trees. You can still put in sky and that will show through the trees. Now I'm going to mix a little, I'm going to grab a little bit of cerulean and mix it with a bit of that darker color. And in the middle of the sky here, I'm going to draw my clouds out a little bit more so that they're not as thick and fluffy. And that's just a warm up to practice how to do this kind of a sky that has some lovely fluffy clouds in it. Now just let the whole thing work for you without titivating it, without, you know, doing a bit more and a bit more and a bit more until all of your white will disappear and your page will start to dry, and then you're going to lose the lovely looseness of the sky. Believe me, it will do a lot over the next hour. What if it just sits there? If you find that you have lost a little bit of the white, you need to use a very, very soft Kleenex, not paper towel. Paper towel is hard and paper towel has patterns in it. So that pattern will often transfer to your watercolor and it's too hard. It will take up too much paint. But a very soft Kleenex, and you kind of like make a little end to it to dab with. If you just use that little end of Kleenex and gently lift while your sky is still wet, not too much. If you do this too much, you're going to spoil the softness of your sky. If you just wanted to get a little bit of white back, if you wanted to sculpt a couple more clouds in there, then just a soft Kleenex is very helpful for that, but don't overdo it. What I see people doing quite often, and I'm going to get an old one here to do it too. What I see people doing is scrunching up their Kleenex and pushing on here to lift off the paint. And then all they get is great big white dry blobs that don't look lovely and soft. Just use your Kleenex cautiously if you need to. And if you just want to get back a little bit more cloud or a little tip to the cloud, just a tiny dab, and then let it do its thing. The paint is going to still disperse into the wet background. It's all going to soften and it will lighten up as it dries. And then when you come back to it later, I think you're going to be quite surprised. And when you come back to it later, if you want to, you can put in some extra details and make a little composition. Makes a nice little card to send to someone, and you can do any kind of a simple little scene to your practice. But that's our warm-up. That's your practice for how we're going to start the composition. So, and you'll need the same colors when you start your actual painting. And a lovely thing to do is carefully with your Kleenex, again very carefully, is to make sure you get the paint and the water off of the tape, because if you don't, it will run back sometimes into your painting and it will make a water bloom in your painting. So it's good to just dry that up, make sure that's all tidy, and then we'll move on to the real painting. And hopefully you'll all feel a little bit more confident now you've done the first step. I'll get the other one there, put this one out of my way. And we're going to go in with the same technique and the same colors. Now, I don't want to rush you. Let's have a look at my little thumbnail here, what everyone's doing. I can see a few. Oh, there's Jan. Hi, Jan. See you there. Okay, everybody's still just working. I'll give you a minute. I don't want to rush you. This is the hardest part of Zooming, is that I can't see when you're ready for the next step in the classroom. I have a quick wander around and I see when everybody's kind of done and ready for the next step. Can't do that here. I can just have a little peek. Put my tray down. Now, the only thing you have to remember when we come to do the actual painting is we're only going to do the sky to the horizon. We're not going to do the sky all the way over the paper like I just did for the warm-up. It's easy to make a mistake like that when you've just practiced something and you've got the hang of it. So I need to remind you, we're just going to go to the horizon line, and you're just going to wet down to the horizon line and do exactly the same as you just did on the practice one. The cerulean down here near the horizon where there's less cloud, and we don't even need to do a lot of this cloud that's down there, and then switch to your darker blue for up here and form your clouds, and make sure that you do your sky behind here. I know we don't see much of it, but we see a little bit here and a little bit here, a little bit through these fronds and a little bit here. And it's nice to have a little bit of sky in the background. Otherwise you get big bold patches there. And you can see from this one that I have the, I have the blue sky showing through some of it. And my one I did yesterday in class, I've got some cloud behind there. I haven't finished this one yet. But it is helpful to have a little bit of sky back there. And of course, all the dark green is going to cover it. So you don't have to worry about that. Move that out the way. Right, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to wet just down to the horizon line across here, ready to do the sky on the real one. So same technique, get your number 10 or number 8 brush.
Number 8, okay.
Yeah, a number 8 or a number 10, a biggish brush. It doesn't have to be that exact size. You don't want it too big if you're doing 5 by 7, or it'll get too wet. And you don't want it too small, otherwise you're going to be all day trying to get that paper wet if your brush doesn't hold enough water. Now I've dipped into my water pot like 3 or 4 times now to make sure I've got plenty of water on there.
And you're also getting the water where the trees are.
Yes, I'm going I'm assuming that this horizon kind of goes along here. I'm even wetting this little island sort of or piece of land showing back here. What I don't want a dry line somewhere weird. If I have a dry line kind of halfway through these trees, it's always going to show through. It's always better to put water right over something so that even if you don't paint it, you don't have a watermark showing through, because that really shows up. Now I'm quite confident that that's all pretty wet. Not, it's not dripping. I don't have big puddles, but my cotton paper is soaking up a good amount of water, I can tell. And I don't want to use that great big brush. I'm going to switch to, still want to use a fairly big brush, my number 8 brush. I can switch to my blue water to keep that one clean. And I want to make sure I've got enough cerulean So I'm just mixing up a little bit more. And remember, my other one was mostly cobalt with a little bit of phthalo blue in it to make it bright. I'll get my colors there. And then I'm going to start with my cerulean. Near the horizon, start near the horizon. And I can always tell by the first stroke if it's going to be strong enough. I want to make sure I get a lovely straight line there. And then as I come through the trees, I don't have to have as much paint because I'm going to have trees there. So I just need to make sure I don't get, like I said, a dry line or an odd line there. And take that about a third of the way up. It doesn't matter if it's a little bit streaky, they can be cloud forming. Then I want to switch to the darker paint. And I always like to start up in this darkest corner and then come down forming those clouds. They're quite nice and big and fluffy. A little bit more cobalt. And if your paint is too wet, you won't get a nice dark sky in there. So you don't want your paint too wet. And then go slowly as you're forming your clouds. Go slowly and look at what the blue shapes are in between the clouds. Figure out what they look like. If your paper is good and wet, if you've done a good job, you'll have quite a considerable amount of time to work. If it's starting to dry up too much, you're going to have to quickly get your clouds in. And that's just an indication that next time you need to go a little bit wetter if it dries before you're finished. Now, as I come over here, I'm dabbing some paint off my brush. I have a little sponge here, and I'm putting less paint over here, just because I'm going to have trees there and I don't have to have as much dark paint over here. Now you can see if I get my consistency of paint just right, not too wet, not too dry, it doesn't move about that much. It doesn't get away from me, so I can really control it. And that's all about controlling the water. So if you want to control your paint, you need to control the water, and that's the key. And I'm just coming down here with a little bit more cloud. Again, not worrying about the cloud too much over on the left side because I know I'm going to have a lot of trees there. And I want it a little bit lighter. I can have it a little bit darker over there. At this point, I need to stop. I know when you're painting, what you want to do is just keep going. You just want to keep adding more color, more paint. And that's where it all goes wrong. So I need to stop. I need to check. Do I need to do anything to the clouds? What I would like to do is just right here, just bring that cloud out a little bit more so it's not too straight at that edge. Take it out a little bit more. Have a little bit of a fluffy cloud there. And this is dangerous too. You don't want to start picking out too much paint. Just a little bit to even up that edge there. That's all I want to do. And then just leave it alone. And let the water do the rest of the work. And it will do. The water will come along and it will work with the paint, and it will soften up, and it will all look very beautiful when you come back to it in an hour or so and look at it. And it should be one of the lightest parts of your painting too. The sand is very light. You don't want the sky to be dark. The trees are dark, so what we want is nice light sky, light water, light sand, in contrast to the lovely dark trees. That's what makes this painting interesting. So after you've done your sky, the next bit we're going to work on is the sand. And you'll be able to do that with the sky still wet. We won't touch any of that wet area. And in just a second, I'll go over some of the colors you can use for the sand, depending on what you have on your palette. I'll give you a minute. I'll just talk about the sand colors because there's a little bit of nuance to the sand. I'll get the photo back again. So in the sand, right here up near the trees where there's very strong sunlight coming through, and the sun must be back here because the shadows are all coming forward like this. So here we want to use an extremely diluted color, either a yellow ochre or a raw sienna, but with a ton of water added to them. So this is almost just stained paper back here. But if you notice, and we're not going to worry, see all these shadows, we're not going to worry about them until the end, right at the end of the painting, we'll put those in. But if you look at here where the sand comes up to the wave edge, this is much darker. This has got a little bit of burnt sienna mixed in with it, and we can even make a sort of a burnt sienna ultramarine blue sort of color to put in back here, this shadow here. And we need that because waves edges always have darker sand next to them because the sand is wet, and it's also casting a little bit of a shadow from the water, which is three-dimensional. And your white edge won't show up unless you have some dark, but we're going to work on all of that like wetted and wet. So we're going to put the raw sienna or whatever color you have coming down from here very, very light. And then we're going to add a little bit more paint here. And then when we get up to the waves, we're going to add a little bit of darker color here. And we're going to let it all blend wet and wet. If you look here, right here, there's this transition right there from dark to lighter sand. And then there's a transition about here from medium to light and then very light back here. We don't want a hard line where this transition is. We just want it soft, wet and wet blend. So that's what we're aiming for. And we need to mix up our colors first. And I have a couple of raw siennas. This one here is a raw sienna light, which is beautiful and light. And I'm really enjoying this one for skin colors because it's so light. And then I have just regular raw sienna here, which is just a little bit darker. I'll put them on a piece of paper in a minute. And then I have yellow ochre over here, which is very similar again. And you can use any of those. And if you wanted to make if you have yellow ochre and you wanted to make it a little bit lighter, you could add a little bit of lemon, or you could add a little bit of the cadmium yellow light just to lighten it up. And I'll do that. I'll just show you them all on a piece of paper. So this is my yellow ochre. And you might say, well, why don't you just use one of them? I like the nuance of having a little bit, and I like to try them all. I just buy them to see which one I like too. I am really liking the raw sienna light. Didn't know I liked it until I bought some. So I'm adding a little bit of lemon into this yellow ochre. And then this is just yellow ochre. And I'll show you them on a piece of paper. Let's grab, this is just my very cheap paper. So let's start with, this is the raw sienna light. And then let's go to the just regular, this is the regular raw sienna. You can see there's a bit of a difference. The regular raw sienna is a bit more golden, a bit more intense, a bit more brown. They make it with a brown pigment and they make the other one with a yellow pigment. Then yellow ochre. So this is yellow ochre. Yellow ochre is more opaque. Usually it's thicker, has bigger particles. But I tend to buy the yellow ochre that's made with the yellow pigment rather than the brown pigment. So again, that's different. And then this is yellow ochre mixed with a little bit of lemon. Now, all of them are fine, absolutely fine for your beach color. And the more water you add to any of them, the lighter it's going to get. As you can see, I added some water to this one. The reason I don't use yellow ochre as much is it is more opaque, it is thicker. And I don't know if you can see that between this raw sienna light and this yellow ochre, how much more transparent this one is, how much easier it is to get a transparent look. This one's made with a yellow pigment, this one's made with a brown pigment. So you can see the pigment sizes are more brown and bigger, and it doesn't give you as much transparency. And the same with the yellow ochre. So they have different properties, they're made with different pigments, and I just like to experiment. So, oh, the other color, I forgot, we need to also make a little bit of the dark color. So burnt sienna. Now my burnt sienna is made with a red 101 pigment, which is different to a lot of other burnt siennas, which are made with brown 7. So I like this red 101 because it's more transparent and less grainy, less granulating. So that's my burnt sienna. Don't know if I said burnt sienna, that's my burnt sienna. And I'm going to make a little bit of burnt sienna and ultramarine blue on my other palette, my bluer palette. And I'm not going to worry about this bit of blue I've got here. It can get absorbed into my color. And I'm going to add a little bit of burnt sienna to the ultramarine blue and some water just to make a bluer grey for the distance. A little bit of water with that so it's not too strong. And then I'm going to stick with my number 8 brush, and I'm going to start up here where it's lightest. My picture bright enough? For some reason it doesn't look very bright to me, but there you go. I hope it is bright enough. Right, so I have to say, now that I've discovered this raw sienna light, I really like using it. So I'm going to start with that on mine. And I'm going to start at the top of the beach. I'm going to avoid the tree trunks and be a little bit careful with those tree trunks because I want them light.
So we're not wetting it first?
No, we're not wetting the sand first because we want a little bit more control, and it's quite a small area and we don't need to make any like clouds or anything like that. So what I am doing is I'm using a wet brush at the moment with no paint on to just ease that down the shore here. And then I'm getting a little bit more. I'm just going to go to my darker raw sienna now, the one and needs to be very watery, and bring that all the way down almost to the water's edge. And then I'm going to switch to a smaller brush, my number 4 brush, and I'm going to water down that ultramarine and burnt sienna mix, and in the distance here, to push it into the distance, I'm just going to bring that up to the waves, and I'm going to grab a little bit of the raw sienna and just meet them together there. And then I'm going to go to the burnt sienna. I'm going to mix the burnt sienna with a little bit of the raw sienna so it's not too dark. And I'm going to come up to the edge of the wave with the point of my brush very, very carefully. And a little bit at a time, damp brush. I'm going to blend those two together with a damp brush, just so I get that little transition into the darker area. I'm going to add a little bit more raw sienna to the burnt sienna. And you need to be very careful coming up to the waves. Use the point of your brush so that you get right in there, and don't wait too long to transition these two colors together. Don't go all the way along the beach and come back and find that it's all dried on you. You're going to have some shadow from the trees in there too. And we can even put a little bit more shadow on later if you want to. So clean, wet brush, just transition those in. Now, a lot of this beach is going to be covered with tree shadow, so don't worry if you don't get a clear transition. I'm going to take a little bit of that, blue mix, just tap it in, the one that's blue and burnt sienna, tap it in close to the wave edge there, behind those trees. Now the thing to remember is everything on your paper at this point will look dark because you don't have any other dark colors in there. But once you get a lot of these darker colors and shadows and everything else in, these colors will then look really light. So all you have to go by is the contrast between this and the white paper, which makes it look much darker than it actually is. So don't panic if you think, oh, I've gone too dark. It's going to lighten up as it dries, and it's going to look much lighter once you put all the other details in. Oh, just work on your sand. The next thing we're going to work on is putting in the ocean color up to the edge of the white waves here. And it's very, very hard to leave the white surf on a painting this small. Really hard to do. And to try and put masking fluid in these tiny lines is also impossible. You would get just blobs of it. It's much, much easier to get something like this P.H. Martin's white, and when you're completely finished, you can go in and you can tidy up the surf edge, add a little bit more sea foam, you know, at the top of the waves. You can see a lot more of the surf just coming down the beach here that I lost with my wash. Comes up the beach here. And I can bring a little bit more up here. And get a little bit more detail. Like there's a lot of detail that you can't leave that tiny, not unless you're working with a magnifying glass and the tiniest of brushes. So I left this one yesterday on the board planning to do this and tidy up a little bit of the white, and just use my P.H. Martin's white for that, just to get back a little bit more. There's a rolling wave here too, with an edge, and quite a lot more surf on this side here. So don't worry if you have some white gouache, some white P.H. Martin, some white acrylic, some white pencil. You can go back and reclaim a bit of that white. Same with the trees. We've done the trees quite a light grey, but if you've lost some of the light grey, you can go back with some white and put in a few a few tree trunks here and there when you're finished, that is. You can even mix the white with some raw sienna, and you can get a little bit of light back that way. So for instance, if I get some raw sienna, mix it with a little bit of this white, and I wanted a bit more light on this tree here, then I don't have pure white, I have a more raw sienna color, and on the fronds, you know, centers. So there's always something you can do to fix up your painting. It's better to try and do it with your negative painting and with practicing, you know, leaving the whites and stuff to start with, because that's good practice. But if it doesn't work, then go back and fix a few things afterwards. Even if you hadn't, you know, if you'd missed a bit of the lovely white sand shadow here, you could certainly go back in and reclaim a bit with a white mix. So let's put that to one side. The other thing is, now I've mixed white in with my water here. I have very opaque water, so I'm going to save that just for mixing white, and I'm going to get some nice clean water. Mix it, get the water dubs off of my painting and put that over here. So I think probably while I was fiddling about with all of that, you probably got your sand finished. So let's think about the watercolor, the color for the ocean. This is going to be the trickiest one, I think, for you to mix and get light enough. And yesterday I was showing how this is Phthalo Green and this is Phthalo Blue in their form that's not very diluted, and this is if they're a bit diluted. Now you want your ocean color to be as diluted as this. You don't want it thick, because you need to see through it. It needs to be lovely and transparent. You need to see the paper reflecting through. If you don't have Phthalo Green, Viridian Green is fine. Most of the manufacturers use a Phthalo Green to mix a Viridian, so it's very, very close. And let me grab I'm just trying to number six brush is probably good. I don't want it too big, and I want to mix my color first. So I'll make a little bit of space here. Take my other blue out of there for a moment, my sky blue, and I'll zoom back a little bit so you can see my mixing tray. So I'm going to start with the Phthalo Blue. It's very strong, remember. And then I'm going to add a tiny bit of Phthalo Green. Got a hair in there, get out of there. Just lift that out. And I don't want to add too much Phthalo Green. I just want to add enough that I have that beautiful ocean color, which is about there. And then I'm going to add a bit more water, so it's nice and transparent. And then I'm going to test it. I don't want to put it in, both those colors stain. I don't want to put them on my paper until I've tested them. And that looks fairly okay. I might add a little bit more of both. A little bit more. I want to have enough to paint the whole ocean. I don't want to run out. And once I've added those colors, I need to add the water to dilute it down, so it's not too thick. And again, absolutely crucial that you test your dilution. And another good thing to do is grab your picture and put it up alongside your paint that you've just made and see if it's pretty close. We're not going to get it exact, we're not making a photograph, but getting it pretty close will be good. The other color we want in here is a little bit of the raw sienna, because I don't know if you can see as you get close to the sand here, the water is transparent, of course, and you can see the sand through the water here. So you need a little bit of the raw sienna mixing wet in wet with the greeny blue so that you get that sand look. And back here, you can see it's a little bit darker on the horizon. Now, you can either do that by adding a little bit more, tiny bit more Phthalo Blue, wet in wet, or waiting until, I waited until this one was perfectly dry, and I added, and I've already added, but I'll show you what I did when it was perfectly dry. I added a little bit more of that paint along the horizon, wet brush, no paint on the brush, and I just agitated that in with a damp brush, going side to side horizontally, making wave patterns to just transition that in. So you can do that. I've gone too dark now because I've done that 3 times, which is a bit too dark, but that's okay. So you can do that when it's dry if it doesn't work when it's wet. Oh, I was going to use my number 6 brush, and I'm going to switch to my number 8 brush, I think. It's always a debate. And I want to put a little bit of water in the middle of the ocean so that I can sort of dilute the paint as I go. And here we go. Now this is where I take a deep breath, because these colors stain. I'm not going to get these out if I do something wrong. So I have to be a little bit careful, and I have to make sure that I start off with a very nice straight line along the horizon. Rest your wrist on the table, use the point of your brush, lift it up, and make sure you get a lovely straight line. Don't paint up to the edge, you're just going to paint up to where the surf starts. And of course I'm coming in now to that area that I wet, so that's going to lighten the paint as I come up here. I'm going to get a little bit of raw sienna. And here I'm going to do some raw sienna, just a little tiny bit, not too much, quite diluted. Back to my Viridian mix, and let that come in, mixing wet in wet with that raw sienna. Remembering that there's surf at the corner here that we can work on later. We don't have to put it all in right now, and we can put some in with the white later on. I'm going to get a little bit more raw sienna on my brush, just a little bit. And I'm going to bring it in just wet here, just tiny bit. And then the last thing I'm going to try, because I think my paint's still wet enough. I'm going to see if my paint's still wet enough. Yeah, it's just still wet enough for me to take a little bit of Phthalo Blue, tiny bit. This is what I mean by a tiny bit. See this little corner here? Grabbed a tiny bit. And I put a little bit of extra Phthalo Blue along the horizon there. Now you have to really be careful that you're not putting wet paint on paper that's starting to dry, because that will make a big waterline. You have to kind of look at it and check and see if it looks damp or not. If it looks too dry, forget it. Do it later in another step. I'm going to grab a Kleenex, and I'm going to make sure that I get any drips or anything wet off of the edge, so I don't have any rumbacks. Now all of this extra wave stuff here I will do later. I'm not going to do it all in one go. This is quite tricky along here, so I think you could do it now, but it's tricky, and I think it'd be good to get some of the other stuff in first before we get too involved in all of this. Also, I find that when I'm doing something like that, I tend to drip paint over what I've just painted right here, and I prefer to go in a little bit dry there. So what we will be working on next is the tree trunks and the greenery behind the tree trunks. So what I'm going to do while you're catching up to me and working on your ocean, I'm going to put my hairdryer over this and just dry it off a little bit. I will mute while I do that so you don't have hairdryer blasting in your ears. There, that's all it needed. I make sure that I get the tape nicely pushed down. The hairdryer lifts it up, so I try and keep my hairdryer in the middle and not on the tape, and make sure I push the tape down, otherwise the whole paper pops up away from the tape and it's very difficult to flatten it out again after that happens. And that's all ready for me to get the tree trunks in and then start working on the greenery. And if we need to take a little break from that, we can always come in and do this little wave area here. And going to mix up a very, very light grey for the trunks. One thing to be careful of is the trunks are extremely light. So you want to make sure that the grey that we're going to mix for the trunks is really, really diluted, even more diluted than the beach. We could leave them white, but that looks very, very stark. I might leave some of the others just white when I put the green in, but it's much nicer, if I grab mine from yesterday here, much nicer if they're a light grey, or I put a little bit more raw sienna in these ones here, just a little bit more yellow. Things that are close to you are warmer, more yellow. Things that are further away are a little bit more blue, more violet. And some of these in the background I just left white. You can put some grey on them later if you want to. So remember, when we're mixing the grey, I don't know why I did it, oh, here it is. When we're mixing the grey, it needs to be really, really light. Some of the areas that are dark are the bottoms of the trees right here. That's pretty dark. There's some very dark areas in the sand. The bottoms of these trees are very dark. There's what looks like sort of just maybe tree stumps and bits of something. It's just lovely, and lovely to have that dark contrast with the light. So we'll make some dark brown for those little areas. And back here behind these tree trunks is really, really dark green. And we don't need to be too fussy with putting that in. We can just put some dark green in there. We don't have to fuss about branches or trunks or anything. Just get some dark in back there. And as long as you have a few tree fronds showing here and here, it's fine to be a bit more impressionistic about the background colors. You know, sort of squint your eyes and just see, you know, dark light. We're going to go a little bit lighter with the lights and not quite as dark with the darks. If you notice, this here is almost black, this color. I'm looking for something that is black. That's black. So I'm going to put a piece of black paper beside that color in the trees there, and you'll see it is almost black. We don't want to go quite that dark, but a nice dark green in there, really contrast. Let's pop that over there. So what colors do we need for the very, very light gray? I'm going to use my raw sienna light and cobalt blue. If your raw sienna is a little bit more yellow, you could add a little bit of rose to that as well. And I'll show you both. I'll show you both mixes. Let's just pour. Oh, I think it's good enough close up, isn't it? You can see. So this is my raw sienna light. And this is my, I'm going to grab my cobalt blue. It's my cobalt blue. Too much cobalt, so I go back and put a bit more raw sienna. And you can see that they are kind of coming up to a grey colour, or raw sienna. Needs to be a warmish grey, so I can add a bit more raw sienna to that. And I get a warmish grey. Now I'll use just my plain raw sienna here, just ordinary raw sienna, which is made with a brown pigment, and a little bit of the cobalt blue. Again, I put too much blue, it's very strong. A bit more raw sienna. Now I've got a greeny grey, but I can take that down a notch with some rose. I've got Quinacridone Rose, or it might be called Permanent Rose. And you'll notice it's a bit too pink now, so I'll add a bit of blue and a bit of water. And then I have a couple of different greys. I have a greeny grey and I have a pinky grey. And that's great. It's great to have a couple of greys. And then I'm going to add a little bit more water to both because I want them really, really diluted. I'm also going to use a little bit of raw sienna as I paint. Now let's grab a piece of paper and test those. Here's my test paper. So the first one is the more greeny grey with the raw sienna light and the cobalt blue. And the second one is the regular raw sienna with cobalt blue and a little bit of rose. And that's a little bit more of a warmer grey. And you can see, I don't know if you can see how diluted they are and still how dark they are on white paper. They are still very dark even when diluted. I might add a little bit more water to them even now. And so when I'm painting the tree trunk, let's put this down here. When I'm painting the tree trunk with one of them, the closer things are to you, the warmer they are. So I'll probably use the more pinky grey for the close-up trunk. Imagine this is it here. And I've added even more water to that one I made and put the trunk in. Now it's quite yellowy colour, so I'm going to grab my yellow ochre or my raw sienna, doesn't matter which one. I'm going to grab some yellow ochre because it's a little bit more opaque, it will show up a bit more. And on the sunny side of that trunk, it's a little warmer, more yellow. So I'm actually just going to wet and wet, add a bit of that yellow ochre, or you can use raw sienna to warm that side of the trunk up with the yellow. The tree trunk that is behind it in the picture is cooler, and I would probably use the more greeny grey for that one. And it has less warmth in it, so green, it has quite a bit of dark in it, so I would use the greeny grey for that one. Now as they dry, those tree trunks, I need to put some shading on them because they have shading, and I can do that with, I remember I mixed that ultramarine blue and burnt sienna for the waves. These ones have dried a little bit. I can put a little bit of that on the shadow side, which is the right, and I can also put a few of those little lines on with that colour to give it a bit of texture. And when they're completely dry, when they're very dry, I'm going to add that really dark stump at the bottom. This is again burnt sienna and ultramarine blue. Add that dark bit at the bottom and some dark bits in the sand. You can't do them all at once. It has to be starting to dry, because if I put this dark on this trunk that's still wet, it just fills the whole trunk up with dark paint, and then you've got a tree trunk that's too dark. So I can, and because of the colors that these are, non-staining, I can suck that up with my brush and get back to a nice light trunk. So even this one is a little bit wet still, so I can just suck up some of that dark paint, and I can still get a soft transition between the dark and the light by using my thirsty brush to suck up some of that paint. And that's one important reason to use non-staining colors such as ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, raw sienna, cobalt blue, because they can all be lifted off, whereas colors like phthalo green and phthalo blue, they cannot be lifted off. They stain the paper and they won't come off. They're lovely though for making rich colors. So I like to stick to the non-staining ones as much as possible. So let's, if you're ready to mix your very, very light grey, then do so. You'll need a really small brush. I'm switching to my number 2, which is about the size of a number 1 in a lot of brushes. The number 2 in the Silver Black Velvet is quite small. So I usually find it equivalent of a number 1. And I'm going to start with the warmer grey for the tree trunk closest to me here. And I'm going to put the most detail on the one that's closest to the viewer. Now I'm leaving a bit of space here to put my raw sienna or yellow ochre, whichever one I choose. And choose yellow ochre just because it's more opaque and it'll push the other colors back, and I'm putting that yellow ochre down on the base of this trunk. And I'm going to lift a little bit of that color off. Now, it will look fairly dark until we get these dark trees in. Now I'm going to the more greeny grey for the tree behind that one, or to the right of that one. Remember, I'm going to put the dark details on later. And then I want my photos. Well, where's the photo gone? So that I'm doing these in the correct order. Yeah, that one's quite dark. And then this one over here is quite warm and light. So I'm going to use the pinky one for this one because it's quite warm and quite light. I added a little bit more water as I picked it up on my brush. It has some shadow close to the top. I'll put that on when this trunk is dry. Add a little bit more burnt sienna to that, get a little bit more browny, because this one back here is a little bit more brown. So I added a little bit of burnt sienna to the grey. And that's the thing, if you leave a lot of these colors on your palette, as you pick up color, you can pick up a couple of them on your brush as you go. You don't have to just pick up the color that you have mixed and pick up a little bit of something else. There is there's one back here. I put a little bit of raw sienna first because it's quite yellow. It's in the sunlight more. A couple back here. And there's some back here. They're getting more and more indistinct as they get into the background, so we don't have to fuss about them too much. And there's some coming down the beach. You just don't want to make them too dark, you know. Remember, they've got to be much, much lighter than the green. And we're going to pop those in. And as you go down the beach here, they are lighter and lighter as they get out into the sunlight and the distance. So we can even come back in afterwards with some P.H. Martins and raw sienna mix to put some of those in if you need to. And pop those in back there. Now I want to the only ones I want to have quite detailed, this one like here that's close to the viewer, and this one here that's a really big tree that looks like there's some coconuts up here. So at the top of this one where it branches out into the fronds, it's a really warm raw sienna, and I'm going to mix a little bit of raw sienna, a little bit of burnt sienna to get it really nice and warm, and I'm going to put that piece in where they branch out. Just there. Just suck a little bit of that up. And this tree, as it comes up to the top, the coconuts, gets a little warmer in the sun there. I'll put a little bit of raw sienna, and just here too. And there's a frond that comes down there. Now that's another thing. the fronds have a spine down the center of each of them that's very light, and I will just put that in with raw sienna light. You can use, I would suggest, if you have a raw sienna, I would add it to a little bit of yellow or lemon just to brighten it up a little bit. I'm going to add a little bit of lemon to that raw sienna because those spines down the center of the fronds are quite light and bright, and it really helps you form the tree if you have those center spines in it. It helps you find where to put your greenery when you come to paint. It's like a little guideline for you. I'm putting those in. I've got my very small liner brush. You can use a number 2, number 1, number 0, a liner brush, something like that, to get those in. And I'm going to pop them all in. I've got my little reference photo beside me so I can see what I'm doing. Thanks, Deborah, for the photo and all the photos she sent me from Thailand. It's always good because when I take photos from the internet, I have to make sure I have permission. I have to write to the owner of the photo and explain what I'm doing. But when it's one of you who sends me a photo, I can just talk to you directly, and you don't mind me using it. And then we can have the photo for use, which is very helpful. I'm just putting in some of these to help put in the greenery. Put one up here. And of course, we can't see all of them or put all of them in. Just helpful to have a few. And of course, as these ones go down the beach and get further away, it's perspective, you know, it goes into like that triangle. They're getting shorter, smaller, and that will give you a sense of distance on the beach. You don't have much detail back here, and you definitely don't need to do as much detail as you see in the photo. You can edit out quite a bit of the detail. We could probably edit out even more. I find it really difficult to edit out too much. Just me. So I've got quite a lot of those. I could put a few more here, I guess. Those fronds in. Ready to put the greenery in, which is our next step. So we need to mix a couple of greens for the greenery. I'll switch my palette. We need a light yellowy green, more, I want to kind of pronounce the more yellowy green and make it a little bit more yellow. And the dark green, I don't want to make it quite as black and as dark. Like I said, it's probably a little bit too, that's what photographs do. The camera adjusts to the light part of the picture, and then it makes the dark part of the picture a bit darker than you would see in real life. So let's get my start mixing my number 8 brush and use a bright yellow. It doesn't matter if you use Azo Yellow or cadmium yellow, that doesn't matter. Just a nice bright yellow. Let's put a bright yellow here. Oh, you can't see that. Let's bring it over a little bit so you can see it. I've already got some blue here from earlier, so it's already looking a little bit green. That's my Azo Yellow. I'm going to just mix a little bit of Ultramarine Blue with that. You don't need to mix much blue with it to get a bright yellowy green. About that much. You don't need it too blue. I have my ocean color here. I'm just going to use it. No reason to waste it. I'll put some yellow with it. Because we're going to make a dark green, we can utilize anything we got here really in blue or yellow or green. I'm putting the yellow with that, and of course that's making a really bright yellow. Green, sorry. And then I'm going to add way more ultramarine than I added for the first green. Way more. I'm getting more blue, ultramarine blue. So we've got a more natural green. And then I want to take that down even more into the dark. So I'm getting some burnt sienna. And adding in some burnt sienna with that. To make a good, really good dark green. Now right here I have some ultramarine blue and burnt sienna. I'm going to make a bit more of that just in case I want to add a bit of dark on top of the green. I can wet in wet add a bit of that. It's almost black. If you mix a good concentration of ultramarine blue and burnt sienna, you'll get something very close to black. I'll show you on my test paper. So this is the ultramarine blue and burnt sienna that I just mixed. Pretty dark. Grab my, this is my dark green that I just mixed with the ultramarine blue, the burnt sienna, and the Azo Yellow, and anything that was on my palette. And then this is the ultramarine blue and Azo Yellow, the light green. Now I can mix any of those wet and wet to get a variety of greens. I can add a bit more yellow, a bit more blue, anything to vary them. But at least I've got 3 colors there to work with, and I'm going to start always with the lightest one. And I'm actually going to add even a little bit more yellow to it. Make sure you've got enough to, we're going to do quite a bit of greenery. So you want quite a bit of paint ready to go for the greenery. And take your time too. This is a time when you can really take your time with the painting. And go to start with my number 2 brush, nice small brush, because where I want to start is I want to start with this big frond coming in here. I'm going to completely ignore this one hanging down from the sky. That's gone. I'm not having that one in there. But we're going to make sure we get this big one in here and then work across and down. And then we'll fill in this area. So we kind of start over at the left, and that's mainly so you don't, if you're right-handed, so you don't put your hand in the paint. If you're left-handed, you might want to start over here and work backwards. But we definitely want to get the light colors in first. So I'm starting with the light green that I made and a very small brush. And you know what I should do? I should put this down just to rest my wrist on and stop me blobbing paint on my paper accidentally. And I'm going from the center, and I actually want to make sure where I'm going up against the spine, I actually connect these fronds along the spine and then pull them down, and some of them come forwards. See, I want to connect them and then bring them down, and I'm sort of flicking my brush. So as I flick, I'm kind of lifting up my brush to the point. You want to make sure you have sky showing through the frond. You don't want to close up this completely. And make sure it comes next to the spine, so you don't have a great big gap between all of these. And I put those in. Those are all with the light yellow green. Now they're still wet, but I'm going to dip in the dark green, same brush, and I want to put a bit of shadow close to the spine, and I'm just going to let that dark green work its way wherever it wants to go on the light green paint. And that's the first one put in. Work at your own pace. Like, don't don't rush these. These are your main details in your painting, so go slow. Look at the reference photo. There's some behind here. And switch from some of the ones. This one in the distance is pretty dark, so some of them I'm going to keep pretty dark. Some of them are very connected, and some of them you can see a lot of sky through. So vary your, vary your colors. And remember, where they come up against the spine, they're kind of connected, and then they separate out. And some of them are quite dark. So I'm switching back and forth from the dark to the light. And this is going to take the most time in the painting, just working your way slowly from frond to frond, putting some in back there, some just as dark green between the light spines. Make sure you have some sky showing. It doesn't have to be exactly like the photo. You use it to help you. So sometimes, as you can see, I put down more paint, so I don't have as much fiddly little strokes. And then as I come to another part, I open them up, and I have more in the way of delicate strokes. Negative painting is very, very hard. So if you put a lot of the positive painting in first, it helps you work the negative around it. For instance, I want to have this light spine, what would be negative painting, because I'm painting around it. But I'm putting some of the other colors in first so that I can come back and paint around it, and that's helpful. And you can see as I build them up, the eye also melds them together and makes sense of what you're doing. I think there's too much white space here, so it's going to take a little bit of color and a little bit of wet color and just close up a little bit of that white space. I'll grab my picture so I'm not copying the picture. I'm just using it to really help me get the right pattern in the trees so they look how they're supposed to look. And the direction of them too, like there's one coming up here, and the direction is sort of coming down in a different direction to these other ones, but you can't see much detail. It gets in here, it gets very dark, so I can sort of just take some dark paint down there and not worry about those as much. And then when I put some of the light ones in, I can put some dark paint in and just let it blend into the light paint so that you get it. Just
Carolyn?
yes.
All of my colors are all just running together, like as though it's too wet. Do I need a drier brush? They're really blending together.
Yeah, I think you need more pigment in your, let me bring mine under the camera here. If you can see, I do have puddles of paint, but they're not really, really wet like the ocean and sky color. They don't move much. I have quite a lot of pigment in them. And the other thing I have right here is I have a wet sponge that I take off a lot of the water, so my brush is only slightly damp. You know, if I wash my brush, the next thing I do is get off the water on this sponge. So I think a little more pigment in your paint mix so that your paint mix is quite, you know, it doesn't move much.
Yeah.
Yeah, and a dry brush. So let me grab my paper. And one thing you can do to experiment whether you've got kind of a good consistency is on a piece of scrap paper like this, you can put your light paint and you can put your dark paint beside it, and they should stay fairly much in their own zone if you've got the right consistency, not too much water. Now let me mix more water with those. So I'll mix more water with this green, and I'll mix more water with this green. And you know what, they've got equal amounts of water. When you have equal amounts in both colors, they stay pretty much in their own zone. Let's see, this one's got more pigment. Okay, so this one's got more pigment and this one's got more water. So now, because they're not equal, this pigment one will flow into the water one. And I think that is the key. Of your two colors, there has to be equal amounts of water and equal amounts of pigment. So when that happens, no matter how watery your paint is or how thick it is, when they are equal, they stay in their own zone. Can you see that?
Okay. Yeah, good point. Good point.
And see, this one has got more pigment in this. I added more pigment and I added more water to the light green. So then the more pigmented one flowed over into the more watery one.
Yeah. And I think I have too much water as well.
Okay. All you need to do is add a little bit more pigment to your puddles and test them. Just test them like I did there. This is cheap dollar store paper, so it would be even worse on this paper than on cotton paper. And just test them. If they stay side by side with very little bleeding, then you've got equal amounts in both that are consistent, and you should be able to. Now, what you do want is a tiny bit of bleeding. You know, you want them to be able to have a soft edge together, but you want them to stay where you put them. And that is the key. That is the absolute key, is to make sure as you're mixing, you've got everything is equal. And
thank you.
And I think that just comes with practice. I think, like everything, you just find that zone and you remember how much you mix with each one, and you kind of remember what that amount is. And from time to time, I know mine is getting too dry or too unpigmented, and I have to grab a bit more paint, a bit more water, and I have to make it back again to what it was before they started to dry up or get used up. And they're quite creamy at this stage when I want a good. Now what I want to have here, so I'm looking at what I'm looking at is here. I'm going to have a very dark area in here, and I just want some light fronds showing through. So I'm going to paint a few light ones in, which is going to help me in a minute with the negative painting of putting the dark in. And that's why this part is quite time consuming, because you have to kind of plan a little bit and work back and forth. I'm putting these light ones in. These light ones even have a bit of raw sienna in them. So again, if I make a raw sienna mix, it has to be the same water to paint ratio as these other ones. I'm just going to put a little bit raw sienna in this one. It has a little bit more of that color. Wash my brush again. Wash my brush on this, on the sponge. And as you work behind a lot of these, you don't need to be as careful. As long as you have your foreground ones quite distinct, they provide a map for your viewer. Your viewer has a map to say, okay, palm fronds, I get it, I understand what they look like, and then the brain will apply palm fronds to all the other blobs of green that you put on there. Now this tree that I'm working on here, this one, this is quite a central, crucial tree. So what I want to make sure is that I get this tree looking very authentic, very like a palm tree, because that's going to give my viewer all the clues to what they're looking at, so that I can just put blobs of green in other places and have them realize that those are supposed to be palm trees too. So I want to pay full attention to what I'm doing with this one, and then the others I'm going to fuss with a lot less. So again, I'm going back and forth between the light green and the dark green. Close to the center of the tree is going to, of course, be much, much darker. So that's where I'm going to put a lot of the darker green. And once it gets into the background here, you can barely see the difference between this tree and the trees behind it. They're all kind of blurred together. There's some back here too that are other trees. Some over here that are other trees. Really gets all blurred. I'm going to take a little bit of that dark brown mix, just go around the coconuts, and there's a bit of shadow at the top of the tree. Pop that in. And now I've got a lot of that main tree in. Put a few more of these in. Now I'm going to take my number 4 brush, slightly bigger brush. I can take that dark green and I can fill in some of this just with dark green. Don't have to be doing too many palm fronds here. I can just grab some dark green and put it in here. And my small brush again, because I'm going into a little tiny spot here. And remember, the base of these trees is very dark, so I'm taking that dark brown and putting in the base of the tree. And these ones, it's quite dark here. And this is where I can put a little bit of shadow. And at this point, you can work back and forth, you know, on your trees, on your shadows. I kind of like to work back and forth. It gives my brain a little bit of a break. You know, my brain's kind of got to a point at the moment where it's overpowered with the green. I just want to stop for a minute and take a break from the green and do something else before I get so overwhelmed by the green that I'm not paying attention to what I'm doing. So I think that's why I'm trying to analyze as I do it, why I do this. Does a little bit of self-analysis here, but I think that's why. I think I just need to do something else for a minute and get my bearings before I overdo the green. Because you can get into such a pattern with doing something that you get bored with it and you just plunk stuff down without really thinking about it. Because you want to just zone out. And so I'm just taking a break and put a little bit of that dark in. Another thing it helps, putting the darks in, helps you get an idea for how much dark you need to use, and it gives you some useful guidelines. So I'm just mixing a little bit more of the dark green before I put the really, really dark green in. So back here, like on the left, I want to go and put this very dark area in back here. But I also want to show some of those fronds. So that's why I let those fronds dry, so that I could come in with the dark and do some negative painting there. And just get that in. It's also very, very dark in here too. Close to the tree. Sort of through here, you don't want to lose your open spaces, your lovely areas where the eye can rest. And just between these trees there is some sky showing, but as you come down closer to the beach here, it becomes very dark. You can see very little in the way of light or detail. And there's stuff on the beach, there's shadows, there's I don't know what. You're going to put some dark in there because you can't even really see what is in there. Between these two trees is a big branch here. And I know I said I don't like to copy too much, but what I'm doing is trying to find the spaces where I put dark and spaces where I can leave sky open. That's what I'm really searching for, to make it realistic. You don't want it too open, otherwise there's too much for the eye to focus on, that it gets confused. You want to leave enough. And I'm simplifying. Of course, in this part, it's much more complicated than this, but it's too far away and the painting's too small. I'm just simplifying this. Because guess what? As long as the brain has the tops of the trees and the shapes of the palms for a clue, it will fill in the rest with whatever it wants to see. You just want to make sure you've got enough resting space for the eye and open space, that's all. And you can see I'm just kind of like now putting a little bit of light and dark and filling in a couple of those areas, and we're getting there. And the further you get down the beach, the less detail you want to put in. Really just some green between the tree trunks. They're not really trunks on a palm, but we'll call them that. You need to have some, some quickly dabbed in fronds. And I'm working mostly in the dark green now. Putting in the dark green between the trunks, bringing down some tree fronds and taking it down the beach so it's not as detailed as it goes into the distance. Switching to my number 2 brush, going further away, and I'm putting a little bit more water, a little bit more blue with my dark mix, just to again put these trees into the distance. Unfold my paper. Actually, I'm just looking at the photo, and these ones out down here out in the sunshine, so I'm actually switching to my more yellowy green for some of these back here, and definitely not doing much detail. There's a lot more sky showing back here. And one other little thing back here, using the yellowy green first. There is, the land is sticking out here, obviously with some greenery on it, some sort of trees. So I'm using the yellowy green, and I'll put a little bit of the blue green on there when I've got that on. Get that out here. A little bit of the darker green closer to here, and I think the land comes back here behind the trees. Again, we don't have to be super fussy about it. It's in the distance. I'm going to get a little bit of brown and a little bit more of that brown on the beach. And a few of those lines around the tree. And so forth. Now we are getting close to finishing, and when you've done your trees, the next thing we're going to do is this wave pattern in the surf. That's going to probably be the trickiest thing to do. If you think your trees have been tricky, a wave pattern in the surf's quite tricky. So I'm just going to leave that for a minute. And we've got 2 things to do. We've got to put the shadows down the beach. That'll be the last thing we put in. And the wave pattern with some sort of lilac sandy color. So let's mix up our lilac color. Let me make sure I do what I told you to do first. Let's look at my notes. Put this to one side. Always need to have a piece of paper to test your color on. Right, so let's get some Cobalt Blue and Quinacridone Rose, or any color that you have in your palette that says rose. Now that's a bit too pink, so add a little bit more blue. And these are very light, so I have to add a little bit more water to that. And then I'm going to get another burnt sienna and ultramarine blue mix. Heavy on the burnt sienna. And I'll get a little bit of burnt sienna here. I'll probably dip back and forth into these colors. And then I get my small brush, and I'll start with the lilac-y color. I'm going to test it here to see what it's like. And I'm going to add a little bit of that burnt sienna grey with the lilac and see what that's like. That's quite nice. A little bit of that burnt sienna and ultramarine blue mixed with a little bit of the lilac. Nice grey color. And a little bit of the burnt sienna. Now you're going to have to use a lot of water with these to get them to look right. So I'm going to add a little bit more water to my, and I might need a bit of raw sienna at some point, so I'm going to get a little bit of that ready. And a little bit of the Phthalo Green and Phthalo Blue ocean colour, in case I need to put some ocean colours in there as well. I'm going to have all those ready. A little bit of ocean colour, a little bit of raw sienna, some of that lilac colour. Here's a little bit of the ocean colour, a bit of raw sienna. See, we can have all of these working together to make the shadows, but lots of water. We don't want to be going too dark. And this is one time where you do really need to look carefully at how these shadows are formed. Like, it's really important to see how they're formed to get them right. There's a white edge to all of this foam here and a white edge where it reaches here, and then there's this dark patch where you can see the sand through it. So I have to have that there to look at as I work my way through those areas. So I'm going to start with the lilac-y colour, the blue and the rose, and there's quite a big patch here. I always start with the biggest patches because that's easier, and I want to get the shape. It's kind of, get the shape right. There's little waves coming into it. I better zoom in. You want to see a bit closer, don't you? And zoom in once more. There we go. Make sure it's focused. Right. Now I'm going to get a little bit of the burnt sienna as well, because I have my little number 2 brush right next to where that comes up against the wave behind it here. It's kind of showing you the burnt sienna of the sand. So I'm just touching a little bit of that burnt sienna to the lilac colour. Now, as you're seeing it on the screen, probably it's more dramatic than is actually on my painting. It's really magnifying the colours and everything, so don't panic too much. It doesn't look quite that crazy in real life. Now I'm going to now get the burnt sienna and ultramarine blue mix, and there's some sort of waves here. I don't want to be like totally exact. I just want to get the shapes kind of so they look a little bit like waves. I'm taking a little bit of the greeny blue colour. It's too greeny blue, and now the ultramarine blue, because there's a wave that, you can see, there's a wave that kind of comes up here. And it also comes up here. It's very blotchy. Now, as you start to put them in, and I have to tell you, it looks much darker on the screen. As you start to put them in, they look kind of wrong and weird, but you have to wait till you get them all in before you make those kinds of judgments. Now I'm switching over to I'm mixing raw sienna with the Phthalo Green colours, and I'm coming over to this side and putting a bit more of the sort of raw sienna and Phthalo Green colours in. And I will put a bit more white over here later too. I don't have enough white here. I'm putting these in and coming up to the back of this wave. Remember, keep most of your colours horizontal, because the ocean always, water makes horizontal shapes. I'm taking the Phthalo Green and Phthalo Blue and putting a little bit of wave pattern in there. very, very thin end of my brush. And like I say, it all looks weird until it's dry and you look at the whole thing. I'm going back to the lilac colour, and I want to put a little bit more of the lilac in here. A little bit of the more browny colour as it comes up here. And it's helpful to just go piece by piece, just bit by bit. Don't worry about the whole thing, just adding a little bit of the raw sienna. A little bit of the burnt sienna. I'm coming up against that wave here. A little bit of the green. Back to the lilac. And I'm diluting my lilac out even more because it's getting lighter and lighter as it goes up the beach. Diluting out my raw sienna. And then all you see pretty much up the beach there is the white surf. Taking a little bit of the burnt sienna, adding a little bit more shadow in here. And I'm also taking the lilac colour and adding a little bit more lilac to the edge of the beach up here, putting it on and then taking my wet brush and just blending that in. And my number 4 brush. Same thing with that lilac colour, just here. Grabbing the lilac close to the white. Wet brush and blending it in a bit just to get it darker close to the waves. Now I'm going to pull back because I know close up that looks horrific close up, and of course it all has to dry, and we've got to put all the other shadows in and possibly a little bit more white surf. And sometimes you might feel that you need just a little bit more dark. I know it seems really, really dark, but it's the dark that makes the white show up white. And you know, if I try and isolate that part of the photo, you'll see that it is pretty dark in those waves. And if you feel like something's a bit too dark, I feel like maybe that's a bit too dark, I'm just going to wet it and blob it in. And then the only thing we have left to do is the shadows down the beach. And those really require a big deep breath and some courage. So the shadows down the beach are going to be pretty much those colours you've just used. Cobalt and rose to make a lilac colour, or ultramarine and blue to make rose to make a lilac colour, and some burnt sienna and ultramarine blue to make a browny grey. The sand is quite brown, so too much blue. We want it to be a browny grey, because the sand is kind of warm. A bit more water with that. And then I'm going to put a little bit of that browny grey with the violet. And then I'm going to test it. I'm going to test it. I've got some, so this is my violet over the sand colour. This is my ultramarine blue and burnt sienna over the sand colour. And then this is kind of a mix of the two. Now I like a mix of the two with a bit more burnt sienna in for that. So what I want to do, and I want it to really be a shadow. They all look okay. For the further away shadows going down the beach, just the cobalt blue and the rose are fine, that like lilac colour. As you come closer to you on the beach, I think that violet colour with a bit of burnt sienna in gives you a bit more warmth as you come closer to you. So let's make a little bit more of those. So cobalt blue and the rose, too much rose, to make a bluey violet. That's great. And then over here I'm going to put a bit of that bluey violet with a bit of burnt sienna for the closer shadows, and hope for the best. And I want my number 8 brush. I don't want to fiddle with these shadows, but I definitely want to look at the shadow patterns. This one's pretty dark. It comes right down to the edge of the wave here. So I kind of want to do that one first. I'm going to use the lilac mixture for that one. And it kind of starts here. Big brush, my number 8 brush. It starts here under the tree. It comes kind of along here, lifting up my brush to get the tip to the end of the shadow, and then out here and down here, all the way to the edge of these waves. Probably not making mine as dark, being a little bit timid. There's one coming out here. You can kind of see the shadow of the fronds there. Now I want to go to the more burnt sienna and violet one, a bit more on my brush. And I'm going to put these ones in. Remember, there's got to be some light space between the shadows. So don't cover up all your light space. And still with my, there's a little bit back here. Hey, I'm going to the more violet one now. From this tree here, coming down, there's some quite big shadows. They don't come right to the ocean, these ones. And I'm going to switch to now number 6 brush, smaller brush, and definitely violet as we go away down the beach. Cooler colours go away from you, and these trees casting shadows forwards. And I'm going to add a tiny bit of cobalt blue to that violet, because back here behind these trees, the trees behind them are also casting shadows out. And I'm going to put a little bit of that cobalt and violet mix on some of those tree trunks. Push them back a little bit. Now just be careful, you don't want to lose your light sand. I'm going to add a little bit more dark to that shadow there. It's wet, I'm just going to add a bit of wet in wet. You don't want to lose the lights because the bright light against the dark shadows is what suggests bright sunlight. And when your tree trunks are dry, you can add a little bit more definition to some of them, make some of them a bit more brown, some of them a bit more blue, push some into the background. And then don't overdo it. But the shadows are crucial to making this look like a sunny, really sunny beach. And I think once you get the dark shadows in, your whole focus is going to be over here rather than on your waves, and you can add a little bit more white to the waves to give a bit more sea foam to them. I certainly will. And if you're not quite finished, we're up at 4 o'clock, and if you're not quite finished, that's perfectly okay. Sometimes you're ready for a break and your eye needs a little bit of a break from what you're doing, and you can come back with fresh eyes and you can just finish up some of the details. And it's better to do that, actually. It's really good to let it dry naturally for a couple of hours. I've got a big blob there. And then come back later and on nice dry paper finish up some of your details, like the tree trunks, a few more tree fronds, some of the shadows, some white paint and so forth. I feel I've got a little bit too much white space in here, and I might come in and just close up a little bit of that white space when the trees are all dry. So let us... That was a bit of an abrupt ending. Sorry about that. I shut the zoom down kind of quickly and finished a little bit of my painting afterwards. I did add a little bit more greenery, a little bit of Dr. P.H. Martin's white to the surf after my painting was dry, and I put the painting at the end of the video for you to look at. So next week we're going to be working on shells or a little sandpiper bird, and I welcome you back next week and looking forward to seeing you. So thanks for joining me. Bye for now.